Yes, I'm Dr Mark Taubert. I'm a palliative care consultant in Cardiff. Thanks for asking me to come along today. I mean, look outside, it's grey, it's rainy, we're in a funeral centre, we're talking about advanced care planning and DNA CPR and end-of-life care. Plus you've got a German at the front, we're not exactly known for our sense of humour. I actually did that joke at a talk this morning already, so apologies to anyone who was at my talk. We don't have a big repertoire as well as Germans in terms of the joke department, so I have to bring out the same ones time and time again. But no, I thought I wanted to give you just a bit of an insight into my world, into what I do, and some of you have very parallel passions and views on these topics as well. And what I suppose we try to do in Wales, in South Wales, and all of Wales as well, to kind of make these conversations perhaps a bit more easy, but also break down some of the hierarchies that exist. So as a healthcare professional, you bring in lots of experience, and then in a 5, 10, 15 minute conversation with someone, you're trying to distill the experience on the person who's not ever been in the healthcare system before, and then suddenly there's resuscitation comes into the mix, and they're thinking, why the hell is he talking about that now? Does he know something I don't know? And so that's how we wanted to kind of put in some education resources to get the level of conversation on a more even keel, in a sense. So yeah, I was going to show you a little video first. See if this works. No. This is from a movie from the 1930s called Jekyll and Hyde. No CGI in those days. Still quite good, I'd say, isn't it? I mean, quite impressive how they do the transformation, panning the camera up and down. Oh yeah, that's the teeth have gone in. Makeup has gone on. The lipstick has gone on. A bit like some of us on a Saturday night. So yeah, just a short still from the film Jekyll and Hyde. And why did I bring up this short still is because CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, for me has two faces, and we've written articles about this in the past. But number one, it's the sort of the great savior, something that you want all the children to learn, everyone to know, and the general public to be able to give if someone collapses on a football field in a park, a very potentially life-saving, effective intervention for someone who's gone into a abnormal rhythm that with electric shocks could be reversed and brought back again. But CPR has two faces, and some of you may have seen this Spanish video, which is on YouTube as well, which talks about this lady who has very little chance of surviving CPR, but has repeat episodes of CPR by a very interventional healthcare system. So we've exported CPR over the decades to absolutely everyone, and now CPR is nearly given by default. And so we've been left with a situation in palliative and end-of-life care, and how we deal with this is something that I suppose I grapple with most weeks now, and the conversations that we have around this are quite important. So I reflected on this a few years ago. So I talk quite a lot, and I talk to a lot of junior doctors, and I wrote a sort of presentation and like this one, and an article a few years ago for the junior doctors in the hospital. Some of them very interventional, and where why wouldn't you give CPR? Why wouldn't you get the arrest team straight away for a lot of these situations? And I wanted to just sort of express what different things we had seen. So it was a Guardian article in the end. So I submitted this to the Guardian, and they really liked the idea and the picture of this, where I said, it's not like casualty, it's not like Holby City. A lot of my patients come in, and when we talk about CPR, they're thinking of what they've seen on the television. Because where else would your frame of reference be, where there's very successful cardiopulmonary resuscitation events? But in the palliative care populations, well, do we have numbers? Do we have figures of how successful it is? So I went off and did a literature search, and we've got a very good librarian in the cancer centre who does a lot of literature searches, and we found a few good papers, including a big meta-analysis that looked at CPR that had been given, and let's have a look at survival numbers from that, and survival to hospital discharge. And it then segmented people into cancer that has spread in the body, so metastatic cancer, and the over 80s. And no surprise probably amongst many audience members, but the figures were very low. So 1.8, 1.9% for people with metastatic cancer survived CPR to hospital discharge. And that figure, even that figure was quite a selected component of people who hadn't had such conversations before. So very low numbers that we were talking about here. So I wrote this article, and some of you will know that I didn't choose the title and I didn't choose the photograph. This is not how you perform CPR, by the way. So completely ignore this photograph. If you're in the park next week and someone collapses, don't give CPR in this way. It's a completely wrong stock photograph. I didn't choose it. I got pilloried on social media why I had chosen this photo, not me. I also had quite explicitly palliative care in the title, and they took that out. They chose a more snappy title. It was shared over 100,000 times on social media, so their tactic worked. But I got quite a lot of people who generally have an interest in promoting CPR, some of the big charities, criticizing me quite strongly for putting this article out. Had they read the article in full, they would have seen that I was talking specifically about palliative care situations. But who reads articles in full nowadays? That just doesn't happen anymore in our attention deficit society. So I'd encourage you to go and have a little read of that. We then wrote an article in the British Journal of Hospital Medicine, and talked about this Jekyll and Hyde situation, in a sense, with CPR, which got quite a big response, and we got a free link with the British Journal of Hospital Medicine, so you can still access that article, where, in a sense, it was a situation in North Wales, where an 89-year-old woman had called out the GP practice, and a district nurse went out to check on her. She was very unwell. The district nurse came into the house, clearly very unwell, not particularly responsive. She called out an ambulance to get her admitted into hospital. There was no advanced care plan, there was no DNA CPR in place. And she came back from the phone, and the lady had no more pulse. The lady had effectively died while she was there. She received another phone call from the ambulance service. Just a few minutes later, she picked up the phone, and they said, how quickly, we're going to send a 4-hour response, do you want any more quickly? And she said, no, actually the lady has comfortably slipped away, and she's died. And they went, oh, okay. And then they went into the next steps of maybe preparing and getting the family involved and letting them know. This nurse was struck off. It led to a big inquest. Why didn't you give CPR? In the absence of a DNA CPR form, you must give CPR. And I just felt, when I read that BBC News article, I felt very sad. I felt, have we reached a point where we can't die peacefully without the paperwork being in place? Do we need paperwork for everything? I mean, I am someone who leads on advanced care planning in Wales, and I will be reviewing our DNA CPR policy, so of course I have an interest in it, but does absolutely everyone have to have a DNA CPR form or an ADRT form that Mireille mentioned earlier in their home, so that they can have a peaceful death? And so the health board issued a memo to all staff: in the absence of a DNA CPR form, you must give CPR. So that was their response to it. Which I also felt was highly dubious and actually ethically quite challenging. So this was, in a way, my letter to the health board, because I contacted them before, I'd phoned them and written to them, and they hadn't gotten back to me. So I put it into this article, which you can still download for free. There was a lot of talk on social media about this, and I don't want to be unreasonable. So it's Betsy Cadwalla, the health board, had a certain agenda at the time, but I think a lot of healthcare professionals are very frightened and fearful of what the coroners will have to say on the matter. It can sometimes depend on the attitude and views of a coroner locally. And so the legal ramifications they're always fearful of. So you can get yourself out of a lot of legal mess if you just give a bit of sort of sham CPR to someone, so that everyone is happy and no relative who lives over in London somewhere can complain that you didn't try your best. But is that really what we want? Is that the sort of society we want to live in? No, it's crazy. It doesn't make sense, and we need to kind of fix it and have a really healthy, clever and intelligent debate about this. In Wales, in 2015, we got an all Wales DNA CPR policy. Now, England haven't got one yet, so we're a bit ahead of them. So it was one big motivating factor in Wales. If England haven't got something yet, let's do it. So we've got an all Wales DNA CPR policy. We have the same forms for everywhere. So if you're in a hospice, if you're in a hospital, if you're in the community, if you're anywhere on a bus, the same form is very recognizable. It transfers between settings, and there's a patient copy within the copies that you can have, and there's a clearly accessible policy as well. The call for everywhere to have an accessible DNA CPR policy in place came many years before that. There was a court case, which some of you may have heard of, Tracy versus Addenbrooks. This lady, Janet Tracy, had lung cancer, was not that ill, was functioning quite well, was involved in a road traffic accident. In that road traffic accident, she broke her neck, and she was brought into an ITU setting. Was quite unwell, so what had brought her in was the road traffic accident rather than the cancer. Often in cancer we think, oh, lung cancer spread to the bones, metastatic cord compression, but this was not the situation with her. She was able to communicate. It was difficult, but she was able to communicate to others. Now, the doctors in her case put a DNA CPR form onto her notes. And then a few days later, one of the junior doctors had a sort of conversation with one of the daughters to say, you know that we wouldn't jump around on her chest if something really bad happened. That was it. That was the end of the conversation. The daughter just sort of nodded, went home, talked to her family. What did he mean? What was that all about? Is that? Then they got a bit paranoid, so they went back. They spoke to the consultant the next day. The consultant said, well, yes, we have put a DNA CPR form in the notes because we don't think it would work should she require it. Oh, and have you told her about this? Because she is compos mentis. No, we haven't. And so it kind of really put a big rift between the healthcare professionals and the family and the patient. And Janet got very distressed about this. These people had been her world. She's lying in this bed, she's looking at the ceiling, these people coming in and out of her world, she trusts them, and then there's suddenly this big secret on her notes that no one has told her about. So she got very distressed about this. And she died some weeks later. She didn't have CPR, so the conversation was brought up again. But the issue that the husband had and brought up in his complaint was not so much the fact that the decision had been made, but that it had not been communicated with someone who was compos mentis, and the biggest effort hadn't been made for a duty to consult someone on this very personal matter. Now, it went to the High Court. The High Court said, sorry, no, we are ruling with the healthcare professionals on this one. Giving or not giving CPR is still very much a medical decision. So it was perfectly in their right to put a form onto the notes, and that was okay. The family appealed and went to the Supreme Court. I'm not bringing up any Brexit analogies here, by the way. It's not appropriate. They took it to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to talk you through a little bit, because often we don't have the time to go into court judgments, a little bit about what the Supreme Court found, because the Supreme Court found with the family in this situation. So let's have a little look at what the Supreme Court said, and I'll read it out a bit. So it's all accessible online if you want to have a read of it with a PDF, and we're going to hear a little bit of what Lord Justice Longmore and Lord Justice Ryder delivered as their verdicts in this situation. If you enjoy reading legal language, you can read the whole thing. I don't recommend it, but for me as a German person, there's a lot of double and triple negatives in here. I had to read some of this 2 or 3 times. But so yeah, bear with me. The Court of Appeal ruled that patients should be consulted in relation to advanced DNA CPR decisions, save in exceptional circumstances, and that Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to respect for private and family life, is engaged by the decision to impose a DNA CPR. There needs to be a convincing reason not to involve a patient in a DNA CPR decision. For a patient not to be consulted about a DNA CPR decision, the clinician would have to consider that to do so is likely to cause the patient to suffer physical or psychological harm. Distress alone is not sufficient. So if I as a doctor go in and say, Ethel, she'll get distressed if I have this conversation about me putting a DNA CPR form into her notes, I don't want her to get distressed, that's actually not a sufficient excuse for me not to have this conversation. Yes, of course, it's not a nice conversation to have, but distress alone is not an excuse. Harm is. So I tell all my junior doctors and all the nurses who can also fill in DNA CPR forms, don't just write, might get a bit of distress from this conversation, write, might actually suffer significant harm when having this conversation onto the DNA CPR form. Distress alone would not be sufficient. The clinical view that treatment will be futile is not a sufficient ground not to consult. In addition, an advanced DNA CPR decision must be made in accordance with a clear and accessible policy. So we have the All Wales DNA CPR policy. This means that local policy should be made available and clearly directed and disseminated to patients. Now, the question I always get asked here is, can you guess what the question I always get asked here with distress and harm? Yeah, what's the difference between distress and harm? And it's a tricky one, I suppose. Distress for me, I mean, any suggestions? Potentially anything that...
Distress is temporary and harm is permanent.
Yeah, that's kind of what I go with as well, yeah. Distress can be, I had a difficult conversation with a nurse today. It's really difficult, but she was right to bring it up, but I feel a bit upset about it. But then the next day you move on and it's okay. Harm, I think, is sort of something quite irreparable. That maybe lasts longer. I never want to speak to that Dr. Taubert again. I was very insensitive that he brought up that topic, and I don't want to see him again. So that constitutes more harm. Or where you have someone who's so anxious and so distressed and has suffered from anxiety, who has even explicitly said to you, do not talk to me about DNA CPR, I don't want to talk about that topic, and you've breached that and you've said, no, I want to talk about it anyway. So that for me is sort of the differential there. Now this is the one with a lot of double, triple, quadruple negatives, okay, so bear with me, I might read it twice. Justice Ryder. In my view, doctors should be wary of being too ready to exclude patients from the process of talking about DNA CPR on the grounds that their involvement is likely to distress them. Many patients may find it distressing to discuss the question whether CPR should be withheld from them in the event of a cardiorespiratory arrest. If, however, the clinician forms the view that the patient will not suffer harm if she is consulted, the fact that she might find this topic distressing is unlikely to make it inappropriate to involve her. I mean, come on. They could have written that in a slightly simpler way. How many triple negatives are there in there? It's incredible. So, if the patient, so if the clinician forms the view that the patient will not suffer harm if they're consulted, the fact that they might find it distressing is unlikely to make it inappropriate to involve them. I recognize that these are difficult issues which will require clinicians to make sensitive decisions, sometimes in very stressful circumstances. I would add that the court would be very slow to find that such decisions, if conscientiously taken, violate a patient's right under Article 8 of the Convention. So this ruling really changed everything for doctors, and it became nearly a duty to consult, except in some circumstances. If you read the full recording, they say only a small percentage of your patient or patient groups should fall into the category of, I think it'll cause too much harm to discuss or consult with them. Only a small percentage should be there. So, important points to summarize just at this moment. We've got an All Wales policy, and all areas that you're working in are likely to have local policies as well and local forms as well. Never that easy though if you've got cross-border arrangements and patients live over one border and have to take a form or take something over to another area. Should be discussed with patients or their proxies unless they have indicated they do not wish to be involved or the discussion is likely to cause physical or psychological harm. And I say the wording should be always very clear and the discussion should be clearly documented in the medical notes. And for me, when I arrive at a house and I see a DNA CPR form that someone else has filled in, for me that is a letter in time from one healthcare professional to another healthcare professional. I always like to see a bit of free text on there, just gives me confidence, and talked previously today about having that free text can be so valuable sometimes. I talked to Ethel on the 23rd of the 4th and she was very clear that CPR is not something she would want. She would perhaps consider coming to hospital for IV antibiotics and various other things. You know, if that's in there, that's worth gold in that urgent situation where you're making quick decisions. Should also always document your attempts to communicate with family. There was a case, the Winspear case, where perhaps not enough of an effort had been made to consult the mother of this young man in this situation, where CPR was then withheld. And so, even if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're admitting someone into a busy hospital, and it's very clear that you're going to do everything you can to avoid the cardiac arrest or death situation. You're going to give fluids, you're going to give blood, you're going to give IV antibiotics. But when it comes to the moment where life is over and the heart stops, you're not going to give full-blown CPR. If you're going to make such a decision and it becomes very clear, you should try your best effort to consult with family. And in some situations my juniors ask me, but what if no one is there? What if I can't get hold of anyone? Document that you've tried. Document that you've made that phone call to that mobile phone at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:15 in the morning, 2:20 in the morning to try and contact them. Be clear that you've attempted it and you've documented it very clearly. And what I tend to do is I elicit views on ceilings of treatment, and I start small. So I don't go in saying, we need to talk about resuscitation and me jumping around on your chest and giving electric shocks, because that's an inappropriate introduction anyway, I find. But sometimes I go in and I sort of say, look, you're feeling a bit better now, you're in the hospice, you're in the hospital setting or in a GP setting, you're feeling a bit better now, it's been quite rough recently, hasn't it? But would you want us to do all the same things again if you were in the situation again? I'm just wondering, because if you go home again and you want to come back into hospital, would you go through exactly the same IV antibiotics, IV fluids, blue light admission into A&E and various other things? You might find that's perfectly okay. A few of my patients have said, no, I wouldn't really want that again. So I start small. I say, would you have IV antibiotics in future? Would you have IV fluids? Would you have IV blood? No, I'm a Jehovah's Witness, so I don't want that. So that's interesting for me as well. So that goes in. So you talk about all the different, I call it the treatment ladder. So I start low on the treatments, and we go higher and higher and higher. And then we talk about some of the big interventions like cardiopulmonary resuscitation, admission to ITU for artificial ventilation and various other things. Now, by this point, I've kind of, I suppose I've bored them to tears with all the other interventions, and we've said yes and no to some of those. And they kind of either they're fed up of hearing me talk, but they also have the confidence that we've said, yeah, go for it for a lot of the other measures, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, whatever. But this big one, no, we're not interested. So I think that completely changes the focus of the conversation. This is one of the Talk CPR videos, so I talk about the treatment ladder approach. So that works quite well. Now, I've written there, do not hospitalize implies a ceiling of treatment in itself. But, of course, you have to dig a bit deeper on that one. So some of my patients say, Mark, do not admit me into University Hospital of Wales, please. I do not ever want to go. And I say, okay, fine, put that in. What if you break your arm? Oh yeah, then I would want to go in. Okay, so that changes the topic of conversation a bit. So you need to sort of dig a bit deeper in terms of what intervention someone would accept and not. That's why advanced care planning is so difficult, isn't it? Because you have got so many different things, and people don't just get complications from their cancer or their advanced cancer, they get other bits and bobs wrong with them, and then do they want those treated? So it becomes a very tricky one to generalize too much in an advanced care plan, and you have to sort of sometimes specify quite clearly. I think discussing DNA CPR as a team, as a GP practice team, or in various settings in a nursing home, or on the wards and the hospital wards is very healthy. Elicit the different views of the multidisciplinary, team, and if you think it's not going to work for an individual, then I think an honest conversation is needed. But I've had situations in the past where everyone has thought, oh, this poor young gentleman. I remember this poor young man. He had advanced renal cell carcinoma. He had metastases everywhere in his body. He was severely cachectic. His entire rib cage was metastasized, but he was one of those quite querulous guys who, I call them well known in the post office. And he was basically always looking for a fight. He liked to have fights with counsel, write letters, and the smallest thing his life would light up if there was like a fight. So of course, when the junior doctor started talking about CPR and DNA CPR, it was fantastic. It was wonderful for him because he was like, no, I want full CPR, and he was just one of those people who like to give as good as he gets, and I think he sometimes knew that he was pushing the lines a little bit, but so it became very difficult because the doctor sort of asked his opinion on it, and he said, yeah, I want full-blown CPR and interventions, and the junior doctors were getting very afraid every night this might happen, and then they would put their hands through a very brittle chest cage, and it would just seem something so awful and so futile, which wouldn't work for him. So in the end, we had a very honest and frank conversation with him, and he sort of said, yeah, I've known all along that I wouldn't want this, and I think he had just a moment where he was less in his confrontational mindset, and we talked it through. But we did give him second and third opinions. So whilst the General Medical Council, so my regulatory body, said in the absence of a DNA CPR form, if I arrive in an arrest or cardiac arrest or dying situation, I don't have to give CPR. They've been very clear with that. If I'm planning in advance and we're talking it through with patients and individuals, and I say, look, I don't think CPR would work in your situation, I don't think the medical team should offer it as part of your treatment plan, and the patient says, no, I don't agree with you, I would want full escalative measures, they do have a right to a second opinion, and it's good practice to offer them a second opinion, even a third opinion, so someone independent to come in. Until then, the All Wales policy tends to suggest leave them for full consideration of CPR. But that sometimes is also a matter of debate within teams. You have to sometimes, it's difficult and it's a hard situation, but you sometimes also have to think of the team or the arrest team or the junior doctors or the nurses who are the ones who are there, who then have to give this procedure in this situation sometimes when they feel, what are we doing here? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve here? This is completely insane. Would you think that DNA CPR forms were properly filled in? Are they legally binding? Hands up who thinks they're legally binding documents. I mean, yeah. Anyone think they're legally binding? Yeah, 1, 2. Okay, hands up who thinks they're not legally binding documents. Not legally binding, so I've got quite a few. Yeah. So they are not legally binding, which is interesting, isn't it? They're kind of an advisory document. So when people say, oh, this one hasn't been filled in correctly, or this is just a photocopy of a DNA CPR form, or this is a DNA CPR form from Shropshire, don't trust that one. No, it's not even legally binding document, it's an advisory document, so you should take it. In the situation you're arriving in an arrest situation, you're assessing something, you're supposed to, as a healthcare professional, weigh up all the evidence that is presented to you. Usually, as a healthcare professional, default probably towards life-sustaining measures, but if someone thrusts a photocopy of a Scottish DNA CPR form in your direction, you have a look at it and you think, actually that looks proper to me, then it is an advisory document, and then it's up to you to make a decision on whether you give it or you don't give it. And other things come into it as well. So if the person in front of you looks like they've been dead for 5 days, then that might also weigh within the evidence for you. So no, not legally binding. What is legally binding, and Mireille has alluded to it, is an advance decision to refuse treatment. Now this is crazy, isn't it? Because advance decision to refuse treatment, they're enshrined within the Mental Capacity Act. The patient can fill them in, have them witnessed, they have to have specific wording. And there's about 20 or 30 of these flying about. You can get some from Macmillan, you can get some from Alzheimer's, etc., etc. So that's good for recognizability, isn't it? So if an ambulance man arrives at the house, oh, there's an ADRT. So, DNA CPR forms, all Wales form, very recognizable, not legally binding. There's quite a few versions around, and actually legally binding. So, makes it a bit tricky, but a very good document to have, legally binding. And, as Mireille said, lasting power of attorney for health and welfare. If you lose capacity, and if my wife has lasting power of attorney for health and welfare for me, anything that she refuses in hospital is like it's coming from my mouth. Okay, that's how powerful that is. And you can, a medical team, ITU team can challenge that, but they have to go to the Court of Protection and get quite a quick order in to challenge that motion. And I haven't heard of that happening that many times. And LPA, of course, classic situation is colleague got phoned by a son from Paris saying, my dad's supposed to go to hospital, he's not going to hospital, I'm refusing that. My colleague pointed out that the dad still had full capacity. I've got LPA though. Yeah, but your dad has capacity and he wants to go to hospital. Okay, they understand, sometimes people hear LPA and they drop every other thinking and they think this person has LPA. But remember, LPA only kicks in when the mental capacity can be challenged in an individual. Okay? And also it's about refusals. So as I said here, if someone comes in and says, I've got LPA for health and welfare, and I definitely don't want you to do this, but I do want you to try this cannabis preparation and pop it in my mother's mouth because I know it'll help the cancer. You don't have to do that. So it's about refusals as such, rather than you can't force a medical team or a doctor to give something that they think is perhaps not ethical to give. We've talked about success rates in metastatic cancer for CPR. I question you again, can someone really express their views on CPR and DNA CPR? I go into these conversations completely thinking that the person in front of you may have absolutely no idea and may have all their CPR knowledge from programs like House MD or various others where it's quite successful. There's actually a few studies that count how often CPR is successful in programs like Casualty, and it's sort of in the 60 to 70% mark, whereas in reality, even with pretty good young healthy patients, it's around 25-ish% more. And then when you've got metastatic cancer, it drops to 1.8%, sometimes even lower than that. So there's a skewed view, perhaps still in the world of how successful these interventions are. Actually, if you look at more modern studies now, the success rates for CPR are actually going up a little bit. Do you know why that is? Is that because CPR is becoming more effective, or?
Because they give maybe oxygen?
Yeah, or no.
More access to defibrillators.
Yes, that's certainly one point. But there's also more of a selection now. So there's actually, I think, more discussions about DNA CPR being held, and so you becoming perhaps starting to become more selective about the people who are going to receive CPR. Remember that CPR is actually completely not indicated at all in a natural dying situation. So what's the most effective part of the CPR cascade in the process? What's the most effective part of it which gets people back into life again? Yeah, it's the electric shocks, basically. So the electric shocks being delivered. So for an abnormal nonsense rhythm of the heart, like the footballer Fabrice Muamba, who collapsed on the pitch very suddenly and then survived 45 minutes or something like that of CPR, he went into an abnormal rhythm, and of course the repeat electric shocks he got brought his abnormal rhythm, his nonsense rhythm, back into a normal rhythm. Now that doesn't happen in natural dying. So someone who's having a natural death will just go into a rhythm. You can shock it 1,000,000 times and it's not going to flip back into a normal rhythm. The heart often in natural dying is the last thing that gives. But you can continue doing chest compressions and giving electric shocks. Nothing's going to happen. So there's zero indication in people who are having a natural death. There's a lot of indication and a lot of help for CPR in people who have these abnormal rhythms. And so we have to get better at distinguishing this in these situations. And I bring up another example. I saw a gentleman on one of the wards who had an ICD device, so an internal defibrillator device, which had been fitted many, many years before for a heart condition of an abnormal rhythm that he'd developed. And 3 years prior to this, he developed then a lung cancer and with metastatic disease. So he was on the ward. He was very unwell, and I talked to him, and he'd had a conversation with one of the junior doctors about DNA CPR, and he didn't want to have CPR. And the junior doctor had done a perfect DNA CPR form. It's really well documented. But then there was nothing really about the ICD. So the elephant in the room was that he was still going to get CPR because the device was still there and might potentially shock him if he went into a rhythm that might be shock worthy and such. Do you know how often the ICD devices still go off? The funeral director people in here might know this if they've ever had a jolt. No, joking. It's very bad humor. Yeah. So typically up to 40 times in a sort of arrest situation where there's an abnormal rhythm. So it is worth having a conversation with people about this. Now, interestingly, in the 10 years since he'd had it fitted, it hadn't shocked him once. So he hadn't actually required it one single time. But he still thought, when I talked about, do you want to deactivate it, just in case it does go off, he thought that if we deactivated it, he'd go and power down. And I don't know what the cardiologist had told him, but I said, no, it remains there, it just gets deactivated. Nothing happens. Your heart will continue as it has over the last 10 years. It just won't shock you in a situation where something like that happens. And he said, yeah, absolutely, switch it off. So it's quite interesting because you can then get a peripheral unit. They've got this laptop, and they kind of have access to these ICD devices, and you kind of phone them up and give them a few codes and switch it off now, please. So it's quite an interesting process to go through. I used to like the crime episode Columbo quite a lot. Did anyone ever watch that? I mean, if you brought that back, and there were a perfect episode of Columbo where the husband phones the unit. My wife, she doesn't want her ICD on anymore. Okay, not many people are laughing. Okay, that's just my imagination. But these things have to be considered in some detail. And you know what? I mean, my patients often have a blacker sense of humor than me, and we talk about these things and we have a chat. And sometimes, these situations, death, dying, end-of-life care, are very close to humor as well. The first time I came into a hospice, there was lots of laughter, and sometimes we just have to have a laugh with the patients and their relatives, and we talk about some of these things. I remember one of my patients, Keith Cass, who wrote a lovely article about talk CPR in the British Medical Journal, a patient article. He was a little bit offended the first time I brought DNA CPR up with him. He said, "Oh, what do you mean I'm feeling quite well at the moment?" I said, "That's exactly when I like to talk to you about it, when you're feeling quite well." And he went away, and then we filled in a DNA CPR form, and he became a really passionate advocate for talk CPR. And I said, yes, I was a bit distressed and offended the first time Mark talked to me about it, but I think this is such an important topic. And so he had lots of chemotherapy, radiotherapy, intravenous antibiotics, and he was a very passionate talker about DNA CPR and talk CPR. And I remember he told me he flew off to Barbados on a holiday, and he tucked the DNA CPR form in his shirt pocket, basically. And I think he was teasing the stewardesses on the flight, saying, "Do not give me CPR." And they were all like, "Oh my God, what is going on here?" So they were all quite worried about it. But he was a very funny guy. He had a great sense of humor, and we had many laughs along the way. And unfortunately, he died earlier this year. So I'll miss him a lot. But he made a big inroads into talk CPR, making it a success. This is the website, the talkcpr.wales or talkcpr.com. if you are more comfortable using something without the Wales name at the end of it, you know. I've got there's several videos on there, but also they linked onto YouTube as well, where there's a Talk CPR section on YouTube. If you type it into the YouTube search engine, I'll talk about the treatment ladder approach there. If you ever want to use that in your local teaching, for instance, it's just a short video, and I've used that in teaching quite a few times, and many colleagues, even in New Zealand and Australia, are using this approach now to talk a few things through. I just wanted to show you a little bit of one of the videos. Let's see. I don't know if we've got sound on here, but yes, we do. Great.
So cardiopulmonary resuscitation is carried out on people whose heart has stopped beating, and so cardiopulmonary resuscitation will involve chest compressions. It may involve using an electric current, a shock, to get the heart back into rhythm. It can also involve giving drugs through a drip.
When I'm called to a cardiac arrest and we have to start chest compressions, etc., it's incredibly traumatic. That's the first thing I can tell anyone about it. Is it's one of those heart sink moments when you know that you have to attend that call. It's often quite chaotic in the sense that there's lots going on, lots of things need to happen very quickly. The chest compressions themselves are quite physically demanding and brutal for the patient, and it's difficult to watch somebody go through something like that. So it's not the nicest procedure to be involved in.
CPR is something incredibly valuable and necessary for many people who might respond.
So you've seen enough of him. But this is a video. It's basically a video that we show to patients and family members. We've got it on YouTube, we've got it on websites, I can show it on my smartphone. We've got little video catalogues as well, cardboard catalogues that we can give to the patient. Keep this, show to your family if you want to discuss this any further. And it kind of gives people like, okay, this is where these guys are coming from. That gives me a way of expressing my views on this topic as well. So you kind of, as I said before, you're creating more of a hierarchy in this conversational context, in a sense. So I don't just go in, say, here's the video, I'll come back later. Of course, I have a bit of a preamble conversation about it. Then they watch the video, and then the next day or 2 days later I might go back. We sent one of those video catalogues, which also has a Welsh language video on it. All the people that you saw speaking just now also speak Welsh. We sent one of the video catalogs. We made 600 of them and sent one to each GP practice in Wales. So in theory, any GP can pick one of these up, they're rechargeable, put it in their bag and take it on a house visit, and then potentially after the discussion leave it and say, do you want to show this to the family members and have a talk about this, if this is something that is important to you. And then we had something nice that happened through the Talk CPR videos, is that people from Falmouth University got in touch with me from the art school, from the School of Graphic Design. So I went down there, talked about these issues in medicine to all these art students, so a room of as many people as you, undergraduate art students, and they had to go off and do a project work for 4 months. And of course, they went into groups and helped me with the Talk CPR, some of the design. And they did a wonderful stop frame animation video, which is also on the Talk CPR website, which discusses some of these issues. And they did this completely for free, and was their project work, and I had to then evaluate them at the end. So just, it's amazing when you reach out and you do certain things and you portray certain elements of your world to people in a different part, in a different profession completely, how that can come together and create something good. So I'd urge you to go and have a little look at that, at some of these videos. In Wales we have the Serious Illness Conversations Cymru campaign, which I'm involved with, and my colleague Dr Nikki Pease goes on tour and talks to everyone from prison staff. She goes into prisons and talks to them, to paramedics, to organ donation staff, to people in funeral home settings, and various others, about what are the most difficult conversations that you face day to day with your punters, in a sense. And of course, for people, when it comes to organ donation, this is often after death. It's quite a tricky conversation to have. Wales has an opt-in system. Does England have an opt-in system? No. Okay. So you can imagine these conversations are quite sensitive sometimes. So Nikki's a real expert on communication skills, has the 6-point communication toolkit, and has really exported this to quite a few people. That's old numbers actually. We've talked to more people than that already. So really important national work that's going on in Wales. We have a website called advancedcareplan.org.uk, which was developed by Diane Matters and by Buenaur as well. We have quite a few videos on there, which Mireille's seen already and been involved with, I think. So explaining what advanced care planning is. So for people who don't want to read a big information leaflet, seeing a video is something slightly more visual sometimes. So we've talked about Jekyll and Hyde. There was a program I was on, BBC Horizon, with Kevin Fong, talking about some of these aspects of the importance of palliative care. Actually, the BBC Horizon program, they started wanting to do a program about this specific area of CPR and DNA CPR, but then the commissioners changed the idea of the program. It became more general about palliative care, but they were very interested in this topic. I don't think there's really been a proper TV program or documentary talking about, specifically about DNA CPR and advanced care planning so far, and perhaps it's too controversial a topic. I don't know how they make their choices. And my registrar James wrote an article in BMJ Opinion, CPR for All, a case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which you might find interesting. And finally, one of the other artworks from Falmouth University, with which I like to finish my slides. I think it's quite clever. Endless hope, hopeless end, which makes you think. You stand in front of that poster and you have a little think about how you might want to be in the last moments of your life, the last days of your life, and where you'd want to be. And so I hope you found that useful. So thank you very much.
Very much for that, and I do recommend that you have a look at some of the videos. They're really useful because they're they deal with the issue sensitively, but also quite effectively, and that's quite helpful when we're faced with Holby City crazy CPR.
But it's still amazing. I just wanted to make one more point, which is when I initially pitched the videos, how many people were really dead set against it. Especially hospital groups, commissioners, managers, and various others saying, "Are you mad? This is really controversial topic." And when I talk to patient groups about it and patients about it, they say, "Why haven't you done this already? This is really patronizing that you think that we wouldn't be able to accept this sort of stuff."
Yeah.
So it's a complete disconnect there. What some people think is acceptable nowadays.
Definitely. Thank you.